I know that Ambassador Burns does not need any introduction. Nevertheless, I'm going to try and say a few words. Currently, he serves as the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but Ambassador Burns served as Deputy Secretary of State, Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, and Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs in the United States. He has also served as U.S. ambassador in two key capitals, both Russia and Amman, Moscow and Amman. So I'm going to begin this conversation, Bill, first by welcoming you back to Beirut. I was telling him earlier, I discovered what a big fan club Bill has in this part of the world.
I'll try not to ruin that in the next hour.
And begin with the question of how has the international landscape changed from when you joined the Foreign Service in the early 1980s to today?
I start with a nice, easy question. Well, first, let me say it's wonderful to be back in Beirut and to offer my congratulations to Maha and to all of our colleagues here. I think this conference is a wonderful advertisement in a lot of ways for what the Carnegie Endowment as a global independent institution has to offer in today's very complicated world. And it's a wonderful reminder for me now as a recovering diplomat of how lucky I am to be the president of the Carnegie Endowment. The short answer to your question is that compared to the world, I entered as a very young diplomat at the beginning of 1982. Today's international landscape is profoundly transformed. I mean, I would argue this is one of those moments on the international landscape that comes along once or twice a century. I entered the American diplomatic service at the height of the Cold War. Within less than a decade, the Cold War was over, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and we entered a period roughly from 1989 until the great financial crisis of 2008 of singular American dominance of the international landscape. I do not mean that as a statement of American arrogance, but that was the reality. Since then, my last 7 or 8 years as a diplomat, we entered a period that doesn't have a name yet, but which I think has at least 3 very important distinguishing features. The first and most obvious is that power is more diffuse on the international landscape with the return of great power rivalry, the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and in that very fluid international environment, challenges to regional order most violently and most visibly in the Middle East. Second, another distinguishing feature, I think, is a whole set of challenges that go beyond the borders or the capacity of any one state. Climate change, the revolution in technology, in artificial intelligence, and synthetic biology, which is moving at a pace and with a scope far beyond the last great wave of the Industrial Revolution more than a century ago. And then an increasing competition in ideas, too, between more open political and economic systems, what seemed inevitable at the end of the Cold War. A friend and former colleague of mine, Frank Fukuyama, wrote a famous book called The End of History, when the question seemed to be only a matter of time and pace about when the rest of the world was going to evolve in a more open direction. Well, history hasn't ended. And today there's an increasingly intense competition between more open models and more closed models as well. And then last but not least, another distinguishing feature of this era is increasing uncertainty about the role of the United States in the world. The United States, the principal creator and defender of the international order which has existed for much of the last 70 years, and now some very significant question marks about the kind of role that America is going to continue to play. So a vastly transformed international landscape. Any one of those 3 distinguishing features would be a big challenge. The 3 of them together, I think, create some huge challenges, not just for the United States, but for all the rest of us.
Let me ask, in this kind of a broader context, I hear you on the challenges, and absolutely. But when it comes to President Trump's policies, are we seeing something fundamentally different from those of his predecessors? Or is it more, the difference is really more in lip service, in what he says, rather than in what is actually being done?
I think it's a pretty significantly different approach for an American president and an American White House in the following sense, that It's not that President Trump invented a lot of the challenges that I just described. He inherited them, and anybody elected president of the United States in 2016 would have had to come to grips with them. What President Obama tried to do, and I would be the first to admit that we made our share of mistakes in the last administration, just as we did in the administration before that, and in many administrations in which I worked, particularly in this part of the world. President Obama's approach was fundamentally that the United States needed to adapt to this changing international landscape, and in a sense, take advantage of the fact that if the United States was no longer the singular dominant player on the international landscape, it was still the preeminent player. We still had a stronger hand to play than anybody else. Our capacity to reinvest in alliances, to build coalitions of countries, is what ought to, at least until recently, set us apart from lonelier powers like China and Russia. And so, Obama's approach, I think, was to adapt, to try to reshape an approach to international order before it gets shaped for us by the rise of other forces and other events. President Trump's approach, by contrast, I think, by contrast not just to Obama, but to his predecessors, has been to disrupt. To question whether or not that international order has served American interests, or whether or not, in fact, we've kind of become hostage to it, whether or not we're tied down by allies and partners around the world, and a preference for a kind of very muscular unilateralist approach to the world, a very transactional approach in which allies, I think, all too often are seen as millstones rather than as assets. And, obviously that approach is differed in different parts of the world, but I think it represents a much different philosophy about looking at how America can best defend its interests in the world than, the predecessors of President Trump employed.
Then, you've, in this context, you've also criticized, or what you've described, what you've considered as the hollowing out of American diplomacy. Can you say a few more words about what you meant by that?
Yeah, and the first thing you should always start, I think, when you talk about American diplomacy, especially in this part of the world, on a note of humility, because it's not exactly as if I can point to, almost 35 years as a diplomat and a pristine record of American achievements in the Middle East or in many other parts of the world. Having said that, I do think that in this transformed international landscape, which is more contested, more crowded, more competitive, diplomacy ought to matter more than ever. Because for the United States, no longer able to rely on our singular dominance of that landscape, it makes sense to want to invest in allies, to work with partners, whether it's, and to deal with adversaries, whether it's in this part of the world or any place else. And that's the essence of diplomacy. And I think, all too often, particularly in Iraq in 2003, but other instances as well, we tended to invert the roles of force and diplomacy. And I think, especially in the Trump administration, there's tended to be a kind of dismissiveness toward diplomacy, reflected not just in cutting the budget for my old institution, the State Department, but in the reality that you have 2 years into an American administration, lots of high-level vacancies. We have a wonderful American ambassador in Beirut now. We don't have ambassadors in Cairo and Riyadh and Amman and Ankara right now. And that reflects, I think, almost a kind of unilateral diplomatic disarmament, which creates real problems for the United States.
So what does that mean for the region? You've just described the disruptions, you've just described the global context, and the dramatically different and historic moment spanning, I would say, at least the past decade, but going on. What does that mean for a region like this region, where we're operating within this great power rivalry between Russia and the US? How do we understand, and what policy framework is possible to deal with Putin's Russia today, particularly in this region, but also obviously beyond this region?
Yeah, well, I think Dmitry Trenin, my colleague, described this very well in the last panel. I think what Putin has done is played a relatively weak hand quite strongly in the Middle East, especially since his intervention in Syria in September of 2015. And as Putin has put it publicly with his usual lack of subtlety, it's not his fault, as he describes it, that other countries with stronger hands have played their hands weakly. And so I think, what Putin has done is to try to take advantage of vacuums in the Middle East, those created by the Arab Spring and everything that's flowed from that 7 years ago, the competition both within societies and across the region to answer the question of what comes afterward, after the Arab revolutions, which overtook so much of the region 7 years ago. And Russia has taken advantage of that as well. So, for the United States, it's not a question so much of how we react to Russia, but it's a question of what we stand for in the Middle East and how we pursue our interests, and at least pay attention to the values that matter to Americans, or at least ought to matter to us in this part of the world. And what I think that means in terms of American strategy is not just doing what we can with even more active diplomacy to deal with regional conflicts, but also to keep our eyes on the deeper drivers of change across especially the Arab world right now. The dysfunctions, the challenges of governance, the challenges of economic opportunity, the challenges to individual dignity that helped produce the Arab revolts 7 years ago in lots of parts of this region. And so I think, that ought to remain an important part of American strategy in the region and something that sets us apart from other competitors like Russia.
I think for many Arabs, I remember when the uprising started, this was to a great extent what they were counting on, this sense of insistence on support for these deeper drivers of change, but also for a certain set of value systems that were seen to be embedded in the whole American dream, American project, American vision, if you like. But moving on to Iran, you played an instrumental role in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that is now the United States has recently withdrawn from. Is the deal still salvageable, or are we headed towards some sort of a confrontation?
I'm skeptical that while I admire the efforts of our European partners to try to sustain the deal, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to do over time. I don't need anyone to persuade me of the threats that Iranian actions across the Middle East pose to American interests or pose to the interests of our friends and partners in the region. I viewed the nuclear agreement, and I led the secret talks with the Iranians through most of 2013, which produced an interim agreement and then ultimately led to the comprehensive agreement in 2015. I viewed that as a way to limit one particular source of insecurity and instability in the region, either a nuclear-armed Iran or an Iranian nuclear program that was unconstrained. I recognized very well, as did my colleagues in the last administration, that it had to be embedded in a wider strategy for pushing back against those elements of Iranian behavior from one end of the region to the other that threatened our interests. And I think there's some fair criticisms of how well or how poorly we dealt with that wider strategy. But I remain convinced that the nuclear agreement was the best of the available opportunities or options for dealing with that one particular risk or danger. And I think what concerns me about my government's approach today is that it seems to be based less on an assumption that you can produce a better negotiated deal and more on the assumption that by applying what is in effect unilateral pressure against Iran economically and politically, you can produce either the capitulation of this Iranian regime or its implosion. And I just think that assumption is not tethered to history, at least as I've understood it, in Iran and in this region. So I'm worried about the consequences of the current administration strategy in the sense that in the short term, first, I think it tends to harden the grip of the hardest liners in Tehran on Iranian strategy and policy, at least in the short term. Second, I think it tends to deepen the fissures and the disconnects in the relationship with our closest European allies, and in a sense, does Putin's work for him. I think third, it reflects a view of this region in which, in some ways, we subcontract our policy either to the Saudis or the Israelis, transfixed by an Iran which is threatening but is not 10 feet tall. And I think what that's produced is to kind of indulge an overreach on the part of the current Saudi leadership, which has created real problems. A human catastrophe in Yemen today, but lots of other unforced errors, which in a sense have actually, over the course of the last couple of years, allowed Iran to gain rather than lose momentum and influence. Fourth, I think, as was discussed in the earlier panel, I do think there's a danger of inadvertent collisions. Syria, as all of you know far better than I do, is a very crowded and contested landscape today. It's not beyond imagination to see a situation in which you have a collision, whether it's between the Quds Force in southern Syria and the Israelis or in some other part of the region, that then rapidly escalates, and in which countries like Lebanon can pay a huge price. And last but not least, I think in terms of long-term American strategy, with the current approach in which we're trying to use American financial muscle to bludgeon other countries into squeezing the Iranian economy, we run the risk that over time we're going to cause countries to want to reduce their vulnerability to the American financial system. You even have the German foreign minister a few weeks ago standing up and saying that, we need to reduce our vulnerability to American financial pressure. And that is going to mean, I think, that economic sanctions, which have sometimes been a very effective tool of American policy, especially when we've worked in coordination with lots of other countries, as we did in squeezing the Iranians and producing an environment in which a negotiated settlement became possible, that tool gets eroded over time. And that's a concern of mine as well.
I think there were two words that you used. One is unitary, and then the idea of reducing vulnerability to the US, which is something also that is new on the scene. There has been obviously the discussion of the joint facility or an attempt to see whether this could be created in one way or the other. And I think it's this disruption also in the transatlantic relationships that has been very critical in terms of even to what extent any kind of policy or a coherent policy can emerge towards countries of the region, whether it's in Syria, whether it's Yemen, or whether it's anywhere else in this region above and beyond that. Let me ask you then turn to another policy in this region, which is the much anticipated Kushner plan or the deal of the century, and ask you, are you hopeful and what do you make of it?
Not especially, is the honest answer. I mean, again, as I said before, I'd be the last person to argue that, the track record of the 35 years I spent as American diplomat is filled with successes on the Palestinian-Israeli issue or the wider Arab-Israeli issue. In many respects, the high point for me, which I was reminded of as I watched the funeral of President George H.W. Bush yesterday on television, the high point for me was sitting behind Secretary of State Baker at the Madrid Peace Conference now almost 30 years ago in the fall of 1991. I mean, that was a moment when, American influence in the world after the first Gulf War, after the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the peaceful reunification of Germany, American influence was at its high point. And I thought that Bush and Baker and others in that administration applied a very skillful diplomacy to bring us to a point where it seemed like the door at least was open to progress on the Arab-Israeli issue. Today we face a much more dismal set of circumstances. I think in this administration, I don't know what the details of the Kushner plan are or will be, but I think it's tilted way too far in one direction. I think there's very little communication that goes on right now between the US government and the Palestinians. I think it seems to be based on assumption that somehow you can just go over the head of Palestinians and Israelis and use, what is a confluence of interest between some Arab states, especially in the Gulf, and Israel, a concern about Iran, which is in many ways understandable, that you can use that as a way to kind of stage manage a solution of the Palestinian issue. And I just think that's a false assumption. Ultimately, a two-state solution is not going to emerge except through direct and serious negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. And I worry that if the two-state solution, whose shelf life is very short, if it still exists,
that's what I was gonna.
that its collapse is going to have a lot of collateral damage in the region, not only for Palestinians and their legitimate aspirations, but for lots of their neighbors, including Lebanon, including Jordan, and I think for Israelis themselves, because it's difficult for me to see how you preserve a healthy Jewish democratic state, which I've firmly supported for many years, if in the land that Israel controls, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, you have a majority Arab population, which isn't enfranchised in the same way as other voters in Israel are. So I think for lots of reasons, it's important, difficult as the history of this issue has been, for the United States to play not only an active role, but I think an effective role as well. And I'm not convinced that the plan that at least this White House is talking about is going to produce that kind of effect.
And it seems to be, it seems to be selling this plan quite well to various countries in the region as well. At least we're seeing quite some, at least public shifts in position, partly with the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu to Oman. And then a greater rapprochement, it seems, do you think this will?
Yeah, listen, I think it's a good thing. This is what the Madrid Peace Conference aimed at doing, was to open the door to healthy relations between Israel and a whole variety of Arab states. But I did not believe then, nor do I believe today, that any of that is a substitute for Israelis and Palestinians hammering out a workable approach to a two-state solution.
Let me turn to the last question before we open it up to the audience. Syria, which is, I think, everyone in this room at least is quite preoccupied with. In many ways, we've seen that the international community and the United States have been unable to achieve their objectives in Syria, the stated objectives of the last 7 years. Now the objective seems to have changed again. We're focusing on the war on terror much more than on, with the acceptance that Assad will stay. Meanwhile, we've seen Iran gain momentum across the region in a variety of ways. And I think the situation we're seeing in Lebanon today, the inability to form a government, is part of this. What we're seeing in Yemen, what we're seeing in Iraq, is part of this kind of tug of war, if you like. So what's the best case scenario for Syria that you see over the coming few years? How should the international community handle a Syria where someone like Assad remains in power, given, that's quite some time off. I don't believe that it's going to be in the very immediate future. The conflict is not over yet and will take some time. But
yeah, the term best case scenario and Syria are not two things you usually associate these days, given the horrors of the last 7 years since the revolution and the civil war started in Syria. And it is a history that's marked by failures in many respects, including some in my own government in terms of our strategy. I think there was an opportunity early on, maybe in the winter of 2012, 2013, in which, a more active, more intense American support for the for the Syrian opposition at that point might have made a difference, not so much in producing a military solution in Syria, but at least in improving our diplomatic leverage. I think it was a mistake when we set a red line the following year in 2013, and then ultimately didn't follow through on it. I think, when you're the president of the United States and you set out a standard like that, there's an expectation that you're going to act on it. Having said that, I think today you have to be pretty sober about what's possible and what's not possible in Syria. So you asked me about best cases. I would say that, in the course of the next year, you avoid a catastrophe in Idlib, which is not a sure thing. There's a danger of another human catastrophe there, that you avoid what I mentioned before, a situation in which you have an escalation of violence or tension, whether it's in southern Syria, between a lot of the external players who are involved in Syria now, that you avoid the same thing in eastern Syria, where today you still have an American military presence as well as lots of other militaries and militias functioning, in which, as Dmitry Trenin suggested earlier, you have a Russia that may be interested in trying to reduce the burden somewhat of its own engagement in Syria, and coupled with, active American diplomacy and working with lots of other players, you might over time produce at least the glimmers of possibility at a long-term political transition. That in the process of doing that, you could begin to build pressure against Iran's presence in Syria. But I think all of that is much easier said than done at this point, given the history of the last 7 years or so. I hope very much that not only my own government, but our European allies and others will continue to pay attention to stability in Lebanon, stability in Jordan as well, because, I think it's easy to underestimate the dangers that this society faces as a result of the spillover or the contagion of violence and insecurity in Syria as well. And so I hope very much that we continue to pay attention to what we have at stake in the stability of a country like Lebanon.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I'm going to open it up now for questions.
Maha from Dean's Council, Kennedy School. I just want you to, how you see the words of Rouhani, that if we are not allowed to sell our oil, we'll not let any drop of oil be sold from the Gulf. Is it a physical threat? It's words. How you see, Mr. Ambassador, these words?
I think there's a lot of bluster in those words right now, a lot of bluster in that rhetoric. I don't underestimate, as I said before, the challenges that Iranian actions can pose for our interests and the interests of lots of our friends across the Middle East. But I think Iran, has a stake in keeping the Straits of Hormuz open because, that's how it's going to try at least to continue to sell some oil. So I don't take that, potential military or security threat that seriously. I do, however, take quite seriously the other sorts of threatening actions that Iran can take across the region.
Thank you. It's Raghida Dargham, founder and executive chairman of Beirut Institute. Good to see you, Bill.
Nice to see you.
Do you regret that you bowed to the condition that Iran had set that, hands off our regional war, our regional arms throughout outside of our borders? I mean, one of the things President Trump is trying to do is correct that wrong, that Iran should be great within its own borders, not in other countries. Do you regret that you did not insist on that? And don't tell me that was
insist on what?
That Iran should not go on with its regional ambitions, because there were resolutions that were annulled in the Security Council that took away preventing Iran from acting outside its borders. In hindsight, do you feel guilty because of what happened? And do you agree with President Trump that it's time to put that on the table now? And do you think there is any negotiations behind the scenes, maybe in Oman, that President Trump could engage in to do a secret deal like the one that you were part of?
Yeah, well, I'd say two things in response. First, as I tried to say before, I don't think there's any question but that the United States had an interest, continues to have an interest at pushing back against threatening Iranian behavior in lots of different parts of the Middle East. My view has been that there's a smart way and a dumb way of going about doing that. The smarter way, in my view, was to limit the dangers of an unconstrained Iranian nuclear program. Was the immediate concern, at least, that President Obama faced. And in the process, to try to embed that in a wider strategy for working with our friends in the region, as well as our European partners and others, to push back against, to the extent we could, against Iran's development of a more sophisticated ballistic missile program, against the dangers that it posed in lots of different parts of the area. I just think we put ourselves at a disadvantage by walking away from the nuclear agreement. It makes it harder rather than easier to push back against that kind of behavior. I don't think it would have been possible to use the weight of American and international economic and political pressure to have produced a comprehensive settlement with Iran on all of those issues in 2013, 14, or 15. I think the smarter approach was to deal with the nuclear issue and then try to build on that over time against Iran. And I don't think that the evidence of the last 2 years, in which you've seen actually Iran's aggressive behavior and threatening behavior increase in lots of ways, Iran gaining ground rather than losing that, reflects the validity of an approach which would say that moving out of the nuclear agreement puts you in a better position for dealing with that kind of behavior. That's my own view.
Ambassador Fadlo Khoury from the American University of Beirut. Hi. Thank you for your insights. They're quite provocative in some ways, but I have a bigger question for you in some sense than Iran or Syria, which is that, as the leader of an institution that's been praised by people as diverse as John Foster Dulles and Bobby Kennedy, now recently, ironically, President Trump, it's hard to figure out how to tweet a positive response given President Trump's lack of popularity in this region. I'm a little bit troubled by the fact that a colleague of yours, Ryan Crocker, made an assertion which resonates more and more today than it did 2 years ago, and he made it in the context of President Trump's election, which is that America has elected almost every time since George H.W. Bush defeated Michael Dukakis, the more isolationist, the more America First president, almost without exception, for 30 years. And you could argue that dates back to Reagan versus Carter. So that's a daunting example for those of us whose primary mission is to promote the best of American values in the educational and the philosophical context. Could you reflect on that from your perspective as one of America's most accomplished diplomats, America's larger mission getting more difficult, as it seems to most of us as Americans that the presidents and the leadership, not the State Department, but all the way to Congress and the Senate, are essentially sending a message to the world that is very much America first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question. And it's interesting that the last 4 elected American presidents all campaigned on an approach of nation building at home, and the importance of focusing on the inequalities, on the challenges that America faces before expanding our ambitions overseas. And obviously, all of them approached that in much different ways. But I think it reflected an understanding of a growing disconnect in our own society, in American society, which to some extent President Trump benefited from in the 2016 election, a disconnect in which there are lots of American voters who don't take as self-evident that American leadership in the world benefits them at home. A large segment of the American population, of American citizens, who are worried about inequalities in our own society, about the challenges of rebuilding infrastructure, which is sorely in need of renovation in the United States. And so we'll question people like me, card-carrying members of the establishment in Washington, who preach the virtues of disciplined American leadership in the world, because all too often what they've seen has been indiscipline, whether it was in Iraq in 2003 or in the global financial crisis 5 years later. So the challenge, I think, is for an American president not to indulge that kind of attitude, but rather to make, I think, the compelling case that can be made that the interests of American citizens, of the American middle class, really do benefit from smart, disciplined American engagement in the world. And secondly, that I've always found that in almost 35 years as an American diplomat that we get further overseas through the power of our example than we do through the power of our preaching. And right now, we're not setting a very good example in terms of the virtues of democracy or open economic systems. And I think that's something that we need to focus on as well, because there is a connection between the health of our society and our influence and our capacity to affect change in the rest of the world. But we have to set a good example, and we have to understand the advantages for Americans of smart, disciplined engagement in the world as well. And that's going to be a bigger and bigger challenge, not just for the Trump White House, but for whomever comes afterward.
There's a question there.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Bassem Sidani.
Hi.
Depending on what you mentioned about Trump approach, it's how to disrupt the New World Order. Here in the Middle East, we have Russia now, we have Iran. What to expect with this approach in the Middle East especially?
What to expect with?
Depending on the approach of Trump,
Yeah.
and how to disrupt the New World Order. And especially here in Middle East, we have rivalry as Iran and Russia for the US foreign policy. What to expect in this area?
It's a good question, and I wish I had a clear answer, because I think one of the hallmarks of this U.S. administration's approach to the region has been a certain amount of unpredictability. Depending on the issue and depending on the moment. And so I think, that creates questions. It's not as if, American strategy in the Middle East has always been coherent in the past. It hasn't. We've made more than our share of mistakes. But what people have been able to predict, I think, is that the United States would remain engaged in the region. And I think there were questions in the last administration about this. And there's certainly questions in this administration about the nature of that engagement. And so, I expressed some of my concerns before about a kind of, as threatening as Iranian behavior can be, I think a singular fixation on Iran in the region can also create problems for us as well, because it magnifies Iran's reach in ways that this Iranian regime doesn't deserve. It's not 10 feet tall. And I think we don't pay as much attention as I believe we ought to everything from the Palestinian issue to some of the deeper drivers of change in the region, whether it's in terms of long-term economic or political opportunity, that are going to continue to be there and that are going to produce more Arab Springs, in the future, unless people and leaderships and governments pay more attention to them as well. And so that's an area as well that, as imperfect as our record has been in the past, I think it's important for any U.S. government to pay attention to.
I'm Nizar Abdelkader, a retired general from the Lebanese army.
Nice to meet you.
You have mentioned probably the Israeli may widen their role in Syria or get more militarily involved in what's going on in Syria in the future. And looking at this possibility really, and when the Israeli declared objective is really, we don't want Iranian to be in Syria or have any influence in Syria. So if this happens, and from my point of view, it's going to happen, would Iran really try to protect its long and heavy investment in Syria, really try to open the Lebanese front using Hezbollah so it could divert the Israelis' action, military action against its presence within the Syrian territory? Thank you.
Well, I mean, there's always the danger of that. Lebanon has lived through similar kind of risks in the past, and I think that risk remains. And so, when we were talking before about the next year in Syria, best case or worst case scenarios, what I hope very much at least is that kind of a scenario, what you described, can be avoided, because history would suggest that there's every possibility that you could see that recur in the future. So I hope very much that doesn't happen. And that's one of the great dangers of continued insecurity and instability in Syria, that it does tend to spill over. That's been one of the painful lessons of not just of the last 7 years, but of many decades before that.
حأتكلم باللغة العربية. زينب الخنزة، ناشطة حقوقية، حقوق الإنسان. بدي أقول أنا إنه الإدارة الأمريكية عندها سلطة إنه تعمل حظر على كل الدول، وحاطة نصب عينها إيران. ليش ما حدد من العنف اللي عم بيصير باليمن وإبادة شعب؟ ليش دعمت إسرائيل تعمل لها سفارة بالقدس وما ردت الفلسطينيين اللاجئين لبلادهم؟ بما إنه هي سلطة قوية، وين سلطتها إنه ترد الناس لأرضها؟ وين سلطتها إنه تمنع إبادة شعوب؟ وشكرا لك.
Thanks. It's a very fair question. Our record in the past has been quite imperfect on a lot of these issues that you described. I think Yemen is a particular concern today. I think it's not only a humanitarian catastrophe, but I think strategically it's turned into a very painful dead end. And I hope very much that the negotiations which are resuming in Sweden today actually produce, some hope of a way out of this catastrophe. And I hope very much that my own government pushes very hard in the direction of a negotiated resolution, because I think that's just one of the instances that you mentioned. But I think it is a particularly painful human story today, and it is not something that's inevitable. It's something that can be resolved through negotiations if there's the will there to do that. And I hope very much that the United States uses whatever influence we have to produce that kind of an outcome.
Thank you.
About
Sorry, the question خلص. We need to move on. There are other questions. Sorry, thank you.
Mr. Burns, my name is Mohammed Sabaiti. I'm a retired general as well, and
seems to be a pattern in that role.
Yes, and I'm a lecturer at the American University of Beirut of International Relations. You just mentioned that there was some factors that prevented the widening of negotiations into the Iranian regional activities during forging the JCPOA. In your perspective, how can now we make that doable and bring them into discussing those activities in any foreseeable negotiations? Because I think it's coming. Thank you.
No, I think those are really important issues, as I said before, and it's an area where we ought not to want to negotiate about it, but we need to push back in practical terms against the Iranians, because they tend to be very unsentimental, as you know, about these issues. Unless they feel counter pressure, it's unlikely that negotiations on those kind of issues, whether it's on ballistic missile development or in different parts of the region, are going to produce very much too. As I said before, I just think imperfect as the nuclear agreement was, and I've yet to meet the perfect diplomatic agreement, that it put us in a better position for then building on that to deal with some of these issues than the current circumstance, in which we don't have a nuclear agreement at all, and in which it's harder to mobilize some of our closest allies and partners on some of those other issues as well. So I saw this very much as a kind of step-by-step approach. If I had thought that we could have reached a comprehensive agreement on all of those issues in one fell swoop a few years ago, I would have been all for it. I just don't think as a practical matter that was possible. So I share your view about the seriousness of those issues, the seriousness of the threats that Iran poses. I just think that there's a more workable approach for dealing with it than abandoning the nuclear issue.
Thank you. Pernille Cartel, I'm head of UNSCOR. Wanted to see if we could get the UN into the conversation, to knowing that multilateralism is under a lot of pressure and still really needed. A UN under a lot of pressure, undergoing very serious reforms. And I'm wondering, Bill, if you were to advise the Secretary General right now on how he would place the UN as an active and constructive player in this region, what would you actually advise him to do?
Yeah.
Easy question.
Yeah. Well, I'm not. This is advising my own government or advising
the
UN Secretary General. Yeah. Well, he doesn't have an easy job. I think a lot of the decisions that my administration have made recently about support for the UN and the kind of dismissive attitude toward the UN that you've all too often heard out of Washington the last couple of years is a mistake, and it's very short-sighted. I doubt I need to convince you that, of course, the UN is an institution that could use reform, that can improve its performance in lots of ways. And that's a reality. It's been a reality for some time. But I think the UN and its various institutions and agencies performs an extraordinarily important role right now, especially in the Middle East. And I hope very much that my government will recognize that and continue to support, not just financially, as significant as that is, but also politically, the work of the UN. So I don't know what I'd advise Mr. Gutierrez. I mean, he's in a tough position right now, and I know he's worked hard to build not only the best possible relationship with the United States and other major donors, but also to try to demonstrate, what the UN does, what its work helps accomplish for lots of players in the international system that, sorely need, that kind of effort today as well. So I'm sure he'll continue to work at that. I'm sure he'll continue to work with the U.S. Congress, which has lots of different voices on these issues, but which is an important player in terms of the nature of the U.S. budget. And I'm sure he'll continue to work hard to try to demonstrate the utility of the UN's work and of the work of its agencies as well. I think that's, at the end of the day, the only way to counter some of the skepticism and the cynicism that you oftentimes hear from in parts of Washington right now, is to continue to remind people of the significance of that work, and to remind people that in a world without that kind of an effort on the part of UN agencies, we'd face much greater insecurity and instability even than we do today.
There's a question here.
Okay, I'm Qasim Jammoud, also a researcher and retired Brigadier General in the Lebanese Army.
There's a trend here.
So it's a lot of brigadier generals now speaking. 2 months ago, President Trump spoke about what he called the century package, or the plan for the Middle East that he's gonna present it next year, 2019. And last week also, the Israeli representatives in the United Nations said that beginning 2019, this plan will be presented also. Eventually, this plan, as we know from its some elements, will disrupt all the region and destabilize the security in all the region. And some say that it's like atomic bomb in the region. My first question is, do you have any idea about what are the elements of this plan other than Jerusalem and refugee out of the table, and what they said, some land in Sinai to be added to Gaza Strip? My second question, what are the consequences that Americans or Trump administration is going for this plan, and are they aware of the consequences of this plan to the region and to the world in general, because it will disrupt all the security in the region and maybe will lead to other things all over the world?
Yeah, I mean, on both questions, I guess the answer to the first part is I honestly don't know what the details of that plan, which has been much discussed, are going to be. I fear, as I said before, that it will turn out to be tilted way too far in one direction and not be seen by Palestinians in particular as a serious basis for negotiations. And in response to your second question, I think all I would say is to repeat what I said before, is that as difficult as the path has been and continues to be toward a two-state solution for Palestinians and Israelis, I think the consequence of abandoning that effort or seeing the expiration of a two-state solution, the consequences of that are negative not only for Palestinians and Israelis, but for lots of other neighboring countries in the region as well. So I hope very much that if the administration puts forward any kind of a plan, that it is significantly renovated from what I fear it will be today, and can provide the basis for a serious negotiation. Because I think the danger of putting forward a plan that's not taken seriously by critical players in the process is that you can then put the last nail in the coffin of a two-state solution, which is already in serious jeopardy today. And I think, as I said, the consequences of that, not just for Israelis and Palestinians, but across the region, are quite negative.
There's a question here and then a question in the back.
اوكي. انا اسمي انس الكردي، راح احكي بالعربي. انا جاي من الشام وبكتب بصحيفة الوطن السوري. ما بعرف اذا بس بدي اسال سعادة السفير اذا بيوافق بالرأي بانه العام 2015 هو العام المفصلي بالشرق الاوسط، لانه بهذا العام ايران اضطرت انه تتعاون مع امريكا لتهدي الوضع بالعراق، ومع روسيا لتهدي الوضع بسوريا. فصار عندها شريكين بالعراق وبسوريا لحتى تحفظ مصالحها، لأنه ما عاد فيها تحسن تحفظ مصالحها. صح الاتفاق النووي كان هدفه أنه يخفض جانب من السلوك المؤذي لإيران، بس بنفس الوقت الاتفاق مع الإيرانيين حول العراق أدى إلى مزيد من الاندفاع الإيرانية بالشرق الأوسط. هذا على مستوى سوريا، بدي اسمع رأيه. على مستوى المنطقة بدي اسمع رأيه فيه. بدي اسمع رأيه كمان بشغلة إلى علاقة بسوريا أكثر. اليوم نحن عندنا صراعات متنوعة حوالين سوريا، الجنوب بين إسرائيل وإيران، والشمال بين الإيرانيين والأتراك، وفي عندنا الوضع بالشرق اللي هو مشتعل بين مجموعة أستانا والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. 2019 هل يحمل أي حرب أو تصعيد لحرب بهدول الأربع مناطق، وأي منطقة هي المرشحة أكثر لتكون تشهد حرب؟
Yeah, both good questions. I think in 2015 on the nuclear issue, again, as I said before, imperfect as the comprehensive nuclear agreement was, I do think it reflected the success of a fair amount of international pressure on Iran to severely constrain its civilian nuclear program and to commit never to building a nuclear weapon. And I think that put international stability in a better position than it was before that, too. And it was no coincidence that Iran agreed to negotiate seriously, because it was a function of international pressure on the one hand, economic and political isolation, as well as a willingness to engage directly. On Syria, as I mentioned before, as you look at 2019, just as you describe, it's a very complicated landscape in which you have sort of different theaters of potential military escalation, whether it's in Idlib, as I mentioned, in southern Syria or in eastern Syria. I worry about the risks of escalation. I think it's going to require some very active and very serious diplomacy on the part of lots of different players to help avoid that and to help create a situation in which, at least over the long term, there's a glimmer of possibility for some kind of a transition in Syria. Because absent that, my worry is that you're not going to see any kind of enduring stability there. You're not going to see large-scale return of refugees. You're not going to see any serious effort at the reconstruction that society so desperately needs, and you're going to see continuing pressure on Syria's neighbors, in particular Lebanon. So I hope very much that in 2019, all of us can avoid those kind of escalations in different parts of Syria and at least preserve the possibility of some slightly more hopeful political transition over time.
Okay, we have two last questions. There's a question, the young lady in the back here.
Thank you. Jasmine El-Gamal, I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and formerly the Syria country director at the U.S. Department of Defense. Thank you, Ambassador, for your thoughtful remarks. And my question actually is a continuation of your last answer when it comes to Syria. So you've spoken about the risk of instability in the region, and one of the largest factors in that is the large number of Syrian refugees in the region. Both Russia and the Assad regime are saying that they want the refugees to come back and that they want to tie refugee return to reconstruction. The Europeans and the Americans have both said that they will tie refugee returns to political progress on the ground in Syria. So my question is, given the lack of progress that any UN special envoy has been able to make on Syria, given that Ambassador Jeffrey has just asked that the next UN envoy not participate in Astana, what kind of leverage, if any, does the US and Europe actually have to compel President Assad to make any kind of change on the ground? And if we do have any type of leverage, how do we go about using it, specifically on the issue of refugee returns, but more broadly speaking on stability in Syria and the region? Thank you.
Thanks. It's a really good question. My honest answer is not much leverage right now to help produce those kind of outcomes, but that is not an argument against the sort of approach that you described. Simply because of the practical reality that I think, economic opportunity and reconstruction, as my colleagues at the Carnegie Middle East Center have, recently written about, is not, the only criteria that refugees are looking at as they contemplate return. A lot of this has to do with the kind of political possibilities that they see as well. And there's going to be a huge inhibition against trying to return to a Syria in which they're likely to face, the severest kinds of repression as well. And so I think there is a connection to the possibility, at least, of a long-term transition. And that's why it's important, even recognizing the very diminished leverage that we and our European partners have right now in Syria, that we continue to push as hard as we can, at least, for that sort of a transition. It's possible that over time, there might be the glimmerings of a Russian interest in talking about those kind of steps toward political transition. There's not much evidence of that right now. But as Russia looks to try to reduce some of its burden in Syria, it's a pretty unsentimental power. It's possible that it could develop some interest, at least at the beginnings of that kind of an approach. So for all those reasons, I think we ought to continue to push in that direction. But we have to be realistic. Our leverage is much diminished today.
هشام دبسي كاتب سياسي فلسطيني من ربع قرن من اتفاق أوسلو حتى اليوم.
عفوا سؤال إيه؟
سؤال. الدبلوماسية الأمريكية مستمرة بترك الفلسطينيين يتفقوا مع الإسرائيليين برضاهم. وآخر محاولة أيام وزير الخارجية كيري فشلت، ونال كيري ما ناله من الصحافة الإسرائيلية من الهزء والسخرية. ألا تعتقد سعادة السفير أن فرضية ترك الفلسطيني يتفق مع الإسرائيلي بظل ميزان قوى ساحق لمصلحة الإسرائيلي هذا ينفي حل الدولتين الذي أنت ما زلت تؤيده وهذا جيد؟
I mean, it's a very good question. People have been predicting the demise of the two-state solution. They're saying it's 2 minutes to midnight or 1 night to midnight, and the clock is going to sound on the end of the two-state solution. I continue to hope, is all that I can say, that it's still possible to produce that kind of an outcome for Palestinians and Israelis, simply because I am convinced that serves the interests of both peoples better than any other alternative that I can think of, and it serves the interests of the region best. I wish I could be more optimistic that in the near term there's likely to be progress in that direction. As I said before, I'm quite skeptical that that's possible, but I hope very much that there's still life in the two-state solution, simply because I think it's so crucial to the future, not just of those two peoples, but of the region as a whole. It's not the only source of instability or uncertainty in the Middle East. It never has been, but it matters. And I think I worry about the fatalism that you see developing, not just amongst Israelis and Palestinians, but also in Washington about this issue, and the tendency to think either it's too hard or it doesn't matter so much anymore. And I continue to believe that it matters. So it's hard to be optimistic in the short run, but I hope very much that we can preserve the possibility of a two-state solution, because I think all of us will be poorer without that possibility.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador Bill Burns for an amazing tour around the world.